Hello, anatomists and physiologists. This video is all about the cardiovascular system, specifically the heart. This is chapter 18 from our text, but chapter 18 is kind of a hefty chapter, so I'm going to break this up into a couple of videos. So this is the first, part 1. We're going to talk about heart anatomy in this video, and we're also going to talk about heart anatomy and also the overview of how the heart controls. Hello friends, post-production Heather here. Just wanted to let you know that this video will only cover heart anatomy and overview of heart anatomy tracks, and then we'll jump into more things later. So what are our overarching goals for chapter 18? That's to talk about heart anatomy, what's going on at the gross anatomy level, what can we see with our eyes, but also what's going on at the cellular level, the histology stuff. We're also going to take a look at heart physiology. We're going to go over kind of like an overview of these events today, what's happening electrically, mechanically, but all of this like regulation of the heartbeat and making sure that we apply our knowledge in clinical applications. That's mostly in another video. It's like a future us problem. Okay, so first question is, where is the heart anyways? I know it's in my chest, but if I were to put my hand on my heart, I'd use my left hand or over my left side of my body using my right hand. So where is it really? And it's kind of funny to describe because the heart isn't this perfectly symmetrical thing, nor does it sit symmetrically in the body. So what we're looking at here, and just so you know, a pro tip here, the really challenging part about anatomy and physiology is knowing what you're looking at, but also knowing how you're looking at it. So what we're looking at right now is a person, and we can see this person has a midline. That's this line down here, that line that cuts you down the center, and we can see they're showing us the ribs, and then underneath those ribs, kind of behind those ribs and that sternum, is the heart. But we know there's other stuff that lives in there, and we'll get to it. So how your heart sits in your body is you have this key-shaped bone called keyhole-shaped bone rather, called your sternum, also known as the breastbone. Behind the breastbone is where the heart lives. It's right in the midline. But how the heart sits in your body, so if this was our heart, kind of sits angled towards the left and also angled a little bit forwards, which makes this really special spot where we can feel our heartbeat the strongest on our left side, right around here. So if you put your hand towards your midline and move it over to the left, there's a point along your ribs by which you can feel your heartbeat the strongest. That's called the apical impulse, and we'll get to why in a little bit. So the heart is center-ish. Moving on down. So there's other stuff next to the ribs, right? And underneath the ribs are the lungs. So the heart is like ever so slightly nestled and snuggled by the lungs. So this heart is constantly beating. These lungs are constantly filling and deflating with air. So everything's moving and grooving, and there's this really important muscle, the diaphragm, the most important breathing muscle, right under there too. So everything is moving. And one of the issues we run into with all of our organs moving and grooving all the time is friction. We don't want friction in our body. Friction creates heat, and heat hurts. It doesn't feel good. And so we have to remember that all this like white stuff, this is like fibrous stuff. And those are membranes. Those are serous membranes that work to reduce friction, but also help to isolate infections if there were to be an infection that would happen in this lung or that lung. I hope it doesn't, but let's say that it did. Serous membranes help protect that. And we'll talk about serous membranes for the rest of the semester because nearly all the organs we'll talk about have some kind of serous membrane going on around it. But more on that later. Okay, so the heart is in between the lungs, kind of sort of on top of the diaphragm. And there's that little part, that apex. Apex means pointy bit. Think about the apex of a mountain. That's the top part. So I'll write that. Pointy bit. So the pointy bit of a thing is usually the apex. So before I move on, if I were to take cross-section, a transverse section like we learned in Bio 430, then this is what we're looking at now. So I have lung, I have my sternum, that's the breastbone there in the front. I have my spine there in the back. So I know that my heart is sitting right in here. And what this picture is trying to show you, yes, is the location of the heart, but also showing you that the heart has a lot going on inside of it. There's lots of chambers in there. So we'll look at those chambers as we move through this lecture. So the heart has two jobs, but it's really just one job. So the job that it has is to transport blood, to take blood places. And it does this in two different ways. The first way, the first place that blood has to travel is to the lungs. So I'll write that on my notes. So when we carry blood, the purpose of carrying blood is to deliver oxygen and stuff. But for the purposes of chapter 18, blood carries oxygen. That's what we care about. When we use up that oxygen, that blood becomes blood that doesn't have that much oxygen in it. And so we call that oxygen poor blood. Well, what do our lungs do? Beautiful oxygen in, carbon dioxide waste comes out. So that blood going to the lungs becomes oxygenated, and we need that oxygen for our cells to be able to do stuff. So it's great. But that process of blood going from the heart to the lungs and back again, that's called the pulmonary circuit. And I'll highlight that, let's see, in red, because we're talking about blood and the heart and stuff. So the pulmonary circuit is when blood goes from the heart to the lungs and back again. So it creates a circle or a circuit. We can also call this pulmonary circulation. Okay, the second place that blood needs to go is everywhere else, to the brain tissues, to my toe tissues, to everywhere in between, and that's called taking blood to the body or to the system. Okay, so now that we've oxygenated that blood, we call that oxygen-rich blood, blood that has lots of oxygen in it. We also need to remove wastes from those body tissues via the blood, and so going around to all the systems is called the systemic circuit, and I'll show you what this looks like. So even though these are kind of really similar jobs, we're going to really different places. So in pulmonary circulation, we're going local, lungs. In the systemic circuit, we're going really far. We're going up to my brain, down to my pinky toes, and so many places in between. And so the power needed to propel blood to my pinky toe and the power needed to propel blood to my lungs right next door is really different. And each side of the heart, the right heart and the left heart, do one of these things. And of course, because we know from 430, for Bio 430, we learned that structure and function have a lot to do with each other. The anatomy of the thing influences how it works, the physiology, and vice versa too. Structure and function is never going away in this class, so keep that in your brain. So what does transport of blood look like? What are these two circuits? So here is a picture from your text. We have here, I'll highlight in yellow, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. But there's kind of a lot going on here. So before I talk about this picture, I want to tell you about a couple of conventions that I think that you should know. A couple of things that I think you should know is that typically in our book, you'll see the color red when we're talking about chapter 18. That's denoting oxygen-rich blood. When we get to the blood chapter, we'll talk about why blood gets more red when it's oxygenated. Blue tends to be oxygen, oxygen poor blood. So blood that doesn't have that much oxygen in it. So those are two things that we already see going on in this picture. We have some blue and we have some red. The other thing is that we need to know some definitions just for easier, okay? So some key terms to know. So arteries, those are vessels that leave the heart. Arteries are vessels that leave the heart, vessels on their way out. But the veins, on the other hand, veins, those are blood vessels that arrive to the heart, that enter the heart. That's important to know because we have vessels entering the heart, vessels leaving the heart. But if we see an artery or a vein, we know automatically that that vessel is leaving the heart, entering the heart. But the thing that's really uniting these arteries and veins, because all of our blood vessels are connected in some way or another, is because arteries, they tend to be big. Veins also tend to be big. So arteries, they tend to be big, like this. Like if I were to draw an artery, so I'll write artery. But then as we get farther and farther and farther away from the heart, that artery becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So much so that it kind of becomes silly to call it an artery anymore. So we start to call that a little artery, an arteriole. This will come back when we get to blood vessels, but I think it's important to talk about so that we understand what's going on here. And then those blood vessels get so super tiny, super duper tiny, and then they start to get big again. And so those vessels that get so super tiny, those are called capillaries. The tiniest blood vessels, and they often exist in what we call capillary beds. Interlocking networks of teeny tiny blood vessels so that that oxygen delivery system is as efficient as possible. But then our vessels get big again because, well, we need to go back to the heart. And so it's the whole system reverses. We have little veins, venules, and then we have the biggest ones of, the returning to heart side, which is called veins. I didn't draw that appropriately, symmetrically, but you get what I'm saying. So what's happening is that we have this big vessel shrinking because it's branching into very tiny vessels called capillaries. And then those vessels return to the heart by veins. And so that's what we need to know in order to understand this picture here. So what we see is, let me get my laser pointer back. Okay, so we have the heart here. The heart has a bunch of chambers. The heart has some top chambers. The heart has some bottom chambers. Regardless, though, we have a right side of the heart. And again, this is anatomical, right? So this would be the patient's right. And then we have a left side of the heart. Notice that the left side of the heart is working towards, if we follow these arrows, the left side of the heart is working towards systemic circuit. And the left side of the heart is working towards the pulmonary circuit. So the right side is for the pulmonary stuff, the left side of the heart is for the systemic stuff, but it's still pumping the same amount of blood. It's still doing the same job, transporting blood, okay? So when blood gets pumped through the right side of the heart, it's not rich in oxygen. This is blue. It's poor oxygenated blood. And so that blood travels into the lungs where it hits those capillary beds of the lungs, gas exchange. That's what happens when you breathe in. Now that blood is denoted in red to know that that's oxygen-rich blood. That blood has lots of oxygen in it now, leaving the lungs. And notice that we can trace that blood back into the left heart because it's a circuit, it's a circle. We leave the heart from the right side, return to the heart on the left side. Now that blood moves through the left side of the heart and goes to all of the body tissues via capillary beds. Very teeny blood vessels, really efficient for gas exchange. And now that we've delivered our oxygen and picked up our wastes, well, we're out of oxygen again. So the whole system starts over. We enter the right heart, and the right heart takes us to the lungs. And then from the lungs, we go into the left side of the heart, and then we go back to the body again. You see how it's a whole cycle. So that's where blood goes. So let's talk about heart anatomy. Before we start looking at really complicated images of the heart, I like to start kind of simple. I'm a cartoon image kind of person, and so I'm going to draw a cartoon image for you so that we have some common language to talk about. So here's my heart. There's my heart. It's a wonky heart. Let's make it prettier, huh? Well, that wasn't better, so we'll just do that. So my heart has 4 chambers. 4 chambers. It has some top parts and some bottom parts. And when I get my eraser, I want to do, we're going to do some erasing, so just so you can be prepared. So the top chambers of the heart are called atria or atrium. So this is the right atrium, and right that's a totally great abbreviation for right, and then this one is the left atrium, left atrium. And then we have the ventricles at the bottom. We have the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And then we have a lot of stuff going on, but the biggest thing that I want to talk about are the blood vessels coming into and out of these chambers. So first we'll talk about the right side of the heart, and I'll draw just in black some blood vessels coming in. So into the right side of the heart is this vessel that enters the right side of the heart, and this is called, I'll draw all my leader lines in blue. How about that? This is called the superior meaning on top, superior vena cava. That's a big vessel coming into the heart. We also have one coming, this vessel comes from the back. So we have a superior vena cava. We also have an inferior one. So it kind of goes like this, into the heart like that, into the right atrium. And this one is called the inferior vena cava. VC, vena cava. So those vessels enter the right atrium, and then blood flows from the right atrium into the right ventricle, and it does this through a passageway. But the thing about the heart is we don't want blood to just like flow freely, because then blood would get trapped and kind of just go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between atrium, ventricle. So that wouldn't be so good. So instead of just a wall here, instead of just a chamber, we have a little hole, but that hole is special because it has 2 little doors, and those doors are called valves. So those doors kind of close, they open and close like this. And so my leader line there, that is called the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve is called tricuspid because it has 3 cusps, and we'll get to this in the lab, but it has 3 little bits, and so we call it the tricuspid valve. So blood flows from the right atrium to the right ventricle, and it gets there from these vessels, the vena cava, the superior one and the inferior one. Blood leaves the right ventricle through this vessel, which is technically an artery called the pulmonary trunk. So blood leaves the right ventricle through this blood vessel called the pulmonary trunk, and I'll erase in between. Okay, so all right, pulmonary trunk in here. Pulmonary trunk. And the pulmonary trunk is kind of cool because it kind of branches, boop, and boop. The pulmonary trunk leads to pulmonary circulation because remember, pulmonary circulation is the right side of the heart. So that's great. I should actually label that. This is pulmonary. The pulmonary circuit. And then the left side of the heart is the other one, the systemic circuit. So from there, blood goes to the lungs, the right and the left lung. So we go to the lungs. So that's the main parts of the right side of the heart that I want you to know. The left side of the heart, we have vessels entering the heart as well. So vessels always come into the atrium first. We don't come into the ventricle, into the atrium. But it's kind of funny because these vessels come from the lungs into the left atrium. So here's a vessel, here's a vessel. There's actually 4 of them. So I'll label these ones in red. So I'll do my leader lines for the left side of the heart in red. There's 2 different vessels. These are the pulmonary veins. And they're called pulmonary veins because they're coming from the lungs back to the heart. And remember, a vein, back one slide, a vein is a vessel coming back to the heart. Okay, so pulmonary veins. We have them on the left, but we also have them on the right. So these are the left pulmonary veins, but we also have right pulmonary veins. Still, though, coming into, so these are this one and this one are the right pulmonary veins. The right pulmonary veins. And so what these vessels do, picture in your brain, is they kind of travel behind the heart and enter the left atrium. So they travel behind the heart, enter the left atrium there. So I'll draw so these vessels travel behind the heart and they kind of enter, I don't know, around there-ish. So that's the entrance point for the pulmonary veins on the right. Okay. So blood flows from the left atrium to the left ventricle in much a similar way. We travel through a hole, but that hole is controlled by a valve. And that valve has a special name. Remember in Bio 430 you learned a bunch of different anatomical terms for the same thing? Yeah, it happens here too, I'm sorry, okay? So this is called the mitral valve. You can also call it the bicuspid valve. Mitral valve or the bicuspid valve. So what happens is this helps make sure that blood only goes from the atrium to the ventricle and not backwards. It doesn't happen that way. So it prevents backflow. So what happens then is blood flows into the ventricle and then it needs to leave the ventricle. And how this happens is through this vessel called the aorta. And so blood leaves the ventricle through this vessel called the aorta. And the aorta is interesting because it goes straight upwards, but then it kind of curves. So the aorta comes up and over one of these branches of the pulmonary trunk, and then it goes behind. And I'll erase for emphasis. Okay, so let me get my little eraser here. I'll zoom in. So we go over one branch, over these chambers, we'll go over this guy. Okay, so this vessel that we just drew is called the aorta. And the aorta, because it's a really important vessel and because it's so big, it has tons of branches off of it. So it has tons of portions. So the part of the aorta that goes up is called the ascending aorta because ascending means to go up, like ascend a mountain. So I'll write that, the ascending aorta. Actually, I'll just write aorta. And then that aorta kind of arches over, so we call that the aortic arch. And then it goes down again, so we call that descending aorta. And that aorta goes behind the heart, and it comes out at the bottom here. So we're following behind the heart, and then we have a little tail of the aorta coming out, and it continues even further down. This is the descending aorta, the part of the aorta that goes down. So we have ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending aorta, and it goes even farther down. The aorta has a bunch of branches off of it that we'll get into when we get into the lab. But these are the major things, the major vessels that are involved. The thing I didn't tell you about the pulmonary trunk and the aorta is that we also have valves in them. So we also have valves. The important thing about valves in the heart is they prevent backflow. They make sure that blood doesn't go backwards, because if blood goes backwards, we're not being efficient. We're not propelling blood in the way we want it to go. And so we have valves in the aorta, so that prevents backflow. And we have valves in the pulmonary trunk. It's kind of like farther up here. This is not really where it is, but I'll just draw it because that's where my labels are. Okay, so this is, they're called semilunar valves. So I'll call this the pulmonary semilunar. Semilunar means semi-moon shaped, so kind of moonish. Semilunar valve. And we can abbreviate that to SL, semilunar. So with the aorta, same thing. This is the aortic semilunar valve, preventing backflow. So we talked about the right heart is all about the pulmonary circuit. The left heart is all about the systemic circuit. The systemic circuit. And that's really important to keep in mind. So we've drawn all over. So this is the basics anatomy that I want you to know so that we can be kind of well-versed into going into what we're going into next. Okay, so heart anatomy, we're going to jump more into this in the lab, and I'm going to show you a couple of pictures. So here we have some images that will help us understand the anatomy of the heart. So we're looking at the heart from the outside. We're also looking at the heart from the anterior. So remember, the big challenge of this class is knowing what we're looking at, but also how we're looking at it. So making sure that we're looking at these titles and these descriptions of our images are going to be really important as we move through this semester. So we're looking at the gross anatomy of the heart from the front. And a couple of things that I want to point out to you is that we can see that the heart is kind of wonky. It's not situated perfectly upright like how we think. It's kind of situated to its side, a little oblong. And remember, the pointy part of a thing is called the apex. So here is our apex of the heart. That's the pointy bit. And remember, the heart is situated in the body to the left and a little bit forwards. That apex is kind of touching your ribs a little bit. And underneath this outer wall of the heart here are the chambers underlying underneath. So we have the right heart-ish here, and the left heart-ish there. And we have some stuff going on here that we've already talked about. Here's our vena cava, the superior one, the inferior one. Here's our right atrium with this little ear flap on the outside. That ear flap is called an auricle. An ear-shaped structure is called auricle. And underneath there is that right atrium and the right ventricle. And then from the ventricle, remember, we go into that pulmonary trunk. And remember, I told you it branches out? There's that branch. Similarly, on the left side of the heart, we have those pulmonary veins. Remember, I told you there were 4. Into that left atrium, left ventricle, and then we follow into that aorta. Remember, I told you it was curvy, so it goes up and over and around and down, and then it has some branches off of it. And we'll go through all of these things, but this is a really great image to come back to. Now we're looking at the heart from the posterior view. So from the back side, here are where all of those vessels are kind of sticking out and where that aorta will follow downwards. I didn't realize I had my pan. I meant to have my laser pointer, but all those vessels and the aorta will actually go down behind. The other important thing, and this is kind of the thing when I was learning this, it kind of blew my mind a little bit. The heart has its own blood supply. So I want to go back one slide. So all of these vessels are to supply the heart with blood. The heart supplies the body with blood, but it also needs to supply itself with blood. It's a little bit meta in that way. So the heart has its own blood supply, and we'll talk about those as well once we get into the lab. So here is a picture of the chambers of the heart, and I can tell because we have gross anatomy of the heart, and this is a frontal section. A frontal section is a slice like this. So down the front or a coronal section, now we can see inside the heart, we can see those chambers. We have the right atrium, and the right ventricle, and then the left atrium and the left ventricle. And notice that the atrium and the ventricles are separated by this wall, by this wall, by this wall. So everything is separated, but what's connecting them are these areas with valves. These areas with valves, these areas with valves. The important thing to note is that atrium, right atrium, does not connect to left atrium, except in one case, and that is when you are growing in utero. When you're growing in utero, you have a hole in your heart. It's right here. So a hole connecting your atria. Because, think back to when you were in utero, you remember, you didn't need pulmonary circulation. You didn't need to convert that oxygen to carbon dioxide. You didn't need that because your mom was doing that for you while you were growing. And so there was really no need for pulmonary circulation. And so you had a hole in your heart. And then that hole in your heart, when you were ready to be born, healed. And it left this little remnant, this little oval-shaped remnant called a fossa ovalis. A fossa is an indentation, and ovalis is an oval-shaped thing. So it's a little like ovally indentation. It's like a remnant of olden times, of when you used to have a hole in your heart, but now you don't. How exciting. So these atria today are not connected. In utero they were, but not anymore. In adulthood, no, not so much. This atrium, right atrium, is connected to right ventricle. Right atrium connected to right ventricle via this little valve here called the tricuspid valve. That tricuspid valve is connected to some stuff. Is connected to stuff called heartstrings or chordae tendineae. That's the word I want you to know. Chordae tendineae. Chordae tendineae are kind of like kite strings. You know, when you pull on the kite, they get tighter. And just like when you pull on chordae tendineae, they also get tighter. And what pulls on the chordae tendineae are these muscles. These muscles down here, let's see, where are they labeled? These muscles down here are called papillary muscles. Papillary muscles are really important for making sure that those valves don't backflow. And just like if you were to pull on that string of a kite, these chordae tendineae get taut and make sure that blood can't backflow when those papillary muscles are contracting. We'll talk more about this in the lab. Once those ventricles contract, that pushes blood through into the next vessel, either the aorta or the pulmonary trunk, and there are those semilunar valves. Notice those valves will prevent backflow of blood, so that doesn't happen. Blood does not flow back into the ventricles. So that happens. We also have some other anatomical features going on the walls of the heart here. You know, there's little squiggly lines here. Those squiggly lines are called pectinate muscles. So this wall of the heart is kind of wobbly because there's some muscles there. They're called pectinate muscles. This back wall of the heart here kind of looks like carne asada to me. And that's called trabeculae carne, meat spicules, which sounds gross and cool. Trabeculae carne, that's what this wall of the heart looks like. So that's the right side of the heart headed into the pulmonary trunk. The left side of the heart heads into the aorta. And we have some differences in the valves here. So on the right side of the heart, we have the tricuspid valve. The left side of the heart, we have the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve. Oh, the other thing I forgot to mention to you on this slide is that notice that the wall of the heart is a little bit different. If you think back to Bio 430, we learned that the heart has muscle, cardiac muscle, and that's what's in the wall of the heart here. It's called I'll highlight it, the myocardium, myo meaning muscle, cardium meaning heart, so heart muscle. So notice that this myocardium is very thick on the left side of the heart. The myocardium on the right side of the heart, less so. And we have to think about the jobs of the heart. The right side of the heart is for pulmonary circulation. The left side of the heart is for systemic circulation. Systemic circulation is traveling a heck of a lot farther, so we need to push that blood with a lot more force by contracting those muscles a lot more strongly compared to the right side of the heart, because we're just like going next door to our lungs. So that's something that's really interesting, structure leading to function. And those cardiac muscles are oriented, these muscle bundles, all oriented. Those are the atria, these are for the ventricles. Notice that how the cardiac muscle is organized is so that we're squeezing, we're hugging, we're tightening so that we can push and propel blood away. So here's some differences between the right and the left heart. See that thick muscle of the left side of the heart compared to the thinner of the right. And it's because where we're going is just different. We don't need it on the right ventricle to pump blood with tons and tons of force. On the left side, we do. Okay. Before we panic at this picture, let's take a thought, take a beat, and see what we're looking at here. We've taken a slice of the heart, a section, and we're looking at all of those valves. So here's the myocardium, the muscle layer, and we can take a look at the differences between those valves. So there is an addition I want you to make to your notes here. Remember I told you that there's bunches and bunches of different names for the same things in anatomy and physiology. This is one of those things. So this guy here, you see how there's 1, 2, 3 things? That is the tricuspid valve, 3 cusps. That's why it's named like that. We can also call this valve the atrioventricular valve, the right atrioventricular valve, or we can abbreviate that to right AV valve. If I'm using these abbreviations in lecture, you can absolutely use them on an exam, just so you know. So the other thing that I want to show you is, okay, so in the ventricles, we have the tricuspid valve, and we also have the mitral or bicuspid valve. And it's called bicuspid because we have 1, 2 cusps. So we can call it the mitral valve. We can call it, this is where we're missing, mitral valve or bicuspid valve, or we can call it the left atrioventricular valve or left AV valve. Left AV valve. Whichever one you like to use them interchangeably, I think, throughout the textbook. So whichever one you want to use, that's totally fine. And then lastly, we have the aortic valve leading into the aorta and the pulmonary valve leading into the pulmonary trunk. These are semilunar valves. Semilunar valves. SL. So if you look on online resources in our textbook, you might see those terms, just so you're aware. So that's the differences in those valves anatomically speaking. And here is a really beautiful picture of those chordae tendineae I was telling you about, those heartstrings. So those chordae tendineae, they reach up and they attach to a valve. And when we want to prevent backflow, when that blood is pushing on that valve, we want those chordae tendineae to stop that valve from going backwards, like the way it's not supposed to go. And the chordae tendineae are secured by this muscle called the papillary muscle. That papillary muscle contracts just like you would pull on that string on your kite to make sure that your kite doesn't fly away, because that would make you sad. Okay, we're going to move on into the pressure differences in the heart. I think I'm going to pause this recording, get a drink of water, and come back.